It all happened during Christmas of 2018. Back then, I was a single dad trying to juggle work and raising my daughter, Sarah, who was only 6 years old. Ever since my ex-wife moved to another state, our Christmases had become simpler, but I made it a point to keep them special. That year, Sarah was obsessed with building toys, so I decided to take her to a local toy store with a good reputation. It was a small shop, almost tucked away in the heart of downtown, but it was always packed during the holidays. When we walked in, the place was decked out with blinking lights and the sweet scent of artificial pine. It was packed with parents and kids, everyone rushing around, buzzing with excitement. All I wanted was to find the perfect gift and get out of there before things got even crazier. Right as we stepped inside, we were greeted by a man who seemed to be the only visible employee. He looked like he was in his early 30s, had a thin mustache, and a smile that was, well, a little too much, if you know what I mean. He was wearing a red sweater with embroidered reindeer that looked just a bit too tight, and there was something about the way he tilted his head when he spoke that gave me a weird vibe. But I brushed it off. He came straight over, asked my daughter's name, and introduced himself as Gilberto. At first, he was overly friendly, like almost trying too hard. He offered to help, said he knew exactly what kids her age loved, and led us straight to the shelves while we followed. For a moment, I felt grateful for the assistance. As he pulled toys off the shelves and gave over-the-top demonstrations to Sarah, I started noticing his questions were off. "Are you from around here?" he asked while adjusting an action figure. I answered with a quick, "Yeah," trying to keep it casual. Then he followed up with, "What about your wife? Is she waiting out in the car?" That question caught me off guard, and I automatically replied, "It's just me and my daughter." He smiled in a way I didn't like he'd just gotten exactly the information he wanted. I tried steering the conversation back to the toys, but he kept circling back to personal questions. He asked where I worked, if we lived far away, and even made a weird comment about how hard it must be to raise a kid on my own. I felt uncomfortable, but I didn't want to cause a scene. After all, we were in a crowded store, and technically, he was just helping. After a few minutes, I managed to convince Sarah to pick out a building block kit, and we headed to the register. Gilberto insisted on wrapping the gift himself, and while doing so, said something that sent a chill down my spine. "You know, it's so inspiring to see such a dedicated dad. Makes me want to know where you live to get some inspiration." I forced an awkward smile, paid as quickly as I could, and left the store holding Sarah's hand tightly. But the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Once we were out of the store, I tried shaking it off and focusing on the rest of the day. Sarah was thrilled with her present, and that's what mattered. We drove home as she chattered excitedly about all the things she was going to build, and the sky started to turn that soft orange of late afternoon. The moment I parked in front of our house, I felt a wave of relief. Our neighborhood was quiet. But as I unloaded the bags from the car, something caught my eye. A small gray car parked a few houses down. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal, but when I looked closer, I saw Gilberto sitting inside, leaning on the steering wheel, like he was watching something. My heart froze. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a coincidence. Maybe he was just passing by. I went inside with Sarah and locked the door, but I couldn't relax. I walked to the living room window and, carefully, pulled the curtain back just a little. The car was still there, but now it was empty. I scanned the area but didn't see anyone. For a second, I thought about calling the store to see if his shift had ended, but I decided that would be overthinking it. As night fell, I tried to go about the evening as usual. I made dinner and helped Sarah build her toy, but I couldn't shake that unsettling feeling, like I was being watched. Later that night, after putting Sarah to bed, the house felt heavier than usual. It was quiet. Too quiet. That lingering discomfort was still there, like something wasn't right. I decided to check the doors and windows again, just to be sure. When I got to the kitchen, I found something that made my stomach churn. A folded piece of paper shoved under the door. I was certain it hadn't been there when we came in. My hands were trembling as I picked it up and unfolded it. It was a note, written in large, messy letters. "It's good to have neighbors around this time of year. The note didn't mention me or my house directly, but the context made it painfully clear it was meant for us. My head was spinning. How had he gotten so close without me noticing? Did he actually know where I lived? I spent the next several minutes trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence, maybe a dumb prank by someone else. But deep down, I knew better. I turned on the TV in the living room, hoping to drown out my thoughts, but every little noise outside made me jump up to check the windows. Around midnight, I heard a faint tapping at the front door. It wasn't a knock. It was soft, almost like someone lightly scratching the wood. My heart pounded as I crept toward the door without turning on any lights. I peeked through the peephole, and there he was. Gilberto was standing on my porch. My first instinct was to grab my phone and call the police, but I froze for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing. He wasn't doing anything. Just standing there, perfectly still, like he knew I was watching him. His features were hard to make out in the dark, but that slouched posture, that slightly tilted head, it was unmistakable. I took a deep breath and quietly stepped away from the door, careful not to make any noise. I rushed to Sarah's room, where she was peacefully asleep, and locked the door behind me. With shaking hands, I called 911. While I waited for the police to arrive, I went back to the living room, keeping the lights off, and peeked out the side window. He was no longer at the door. My mind raced. Had he left? Or was he still somewhere nearby, lurking in the shadows? When the police arrived a few minutes later, it felt like the whole thing had been a bad dream. I explained what happened, showed them the note, and described Gilberto, but they couldn't find anyone in the area. One of the officers was polite, but clearly skeptical, suggesting it could have been a misunderstanding. But I knew it wasn't. They promised to patrol the neighborhood through the night, but as soon as they left, that awful feeling of dread came rushing back. I barely slept, waking up at every little creak and noise in the house. It wasn't until morning, when I stepped outside to grab the newspaper, that I realized he'd been back. Taped to my door was another note. This time it read, "I told you, neighbors are important." That message sent me into a full-blown panic. It was clear he was toying with my sanity, and it made me as furious as it did terrified. I took the note straight to the local police station. This time, the officer on duty listened to me more seriously than the others and officially filed a report. He assured me they'd increase patrols in my neighborhood and urged me to call immediately if I saw any sign of him again. While that brought some comfort, the feeling of being watched didn't go away. From that pub, I spent the day reinforcing locks and trying to act normal for Sarah's sake, but it was clear she could sense my tension. What happened that night, however, was beyond anything I could have imagined. After putting Sarah to bed, I laid down on the couch in the living room, hoping to get some rest, but sleep wouldn't come. I stared at the Christmas lights blinking outside the window, their flickering casting soft shadows on the walls. That's when I heard a sound coming from the backyard. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like something dragging across the grass. I got up slowly, grabbed a flashlight, and went to the kitchen, which had a view of the yard. When I turned on the flashlight and aimed it outside, my blood ran cold. Someone had written "Happy Holidays" on the window, not on the outside, but on the inside, using what looked like grease or some kind of oil dripping down the glass. In that moment, my mind went into overdrive. I knew I'd locked every door and window. How could someone have gotten in without me noticing? My heart was pounding, but I knew I had to check on Sarah. I climbed the stairs carefully, every step feeling louder than it should. When I opened her bedroom door, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief seeing her asleep, hugging her teddy bear. Still, I locked the door from the inside and stood there for a few minutes, trying to figure out what to do. Fear told me to grab my daughter and run, but my instincts as a father told me I couldn't risk exposing her to the danger outside. I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I called the police again, but as I held the phone to my ear, I heard a sound that froze me in place. Heavy footsteps downstairs. This time, it wasn't my imagination. Someone was inside my house. Pressing the phone tightly to my ear, I whispered to the dispatcher what was happening. They urged me to stay calm and remain where I was while a patrol car was dispatched. I followed their instructions, but the footsteps grew louder, moving closer and closer, up the stairs. I locked Sarah's door, shoved a dresser in front of it, and stood there in complete silence, clutching a lamp as my only weapon. My daughter stirred awake and whispered, "Daddy, what's going on?" clutching my arm. I tried to keep my voice calm, telling her to stay quiet. The footsteps stopped right outside the bedroom door. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. I stood there, every muscle tense, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure whoever was outside could hear it. Then, the doorknob slowly turned. The lock held, but the sound was enough to make Sarah hold on to me tighter. The intruder pushed against the door, but the dresser kept it from budging. Then, in the distance, I heard the sound of police sirens. They grew louder, cutting through the tension like a lifeline. The noise seemed to spook whoever was outside because the footsteps quickly retreated down the stairs. Moments later, I heard the back door slam shut. When I finally felt it was safe, I peeked out the bedroom window. I saw Gilberto running across the yard and disappearing around the corner. Minutes later, the police arrived. They searched the house and found the back door forced open. I explained everything that had happened and handed over the notes as evidence. That night, the police escorted Sarah and me to a hotel while they began their search for him. A few weeks later, I got a call from the investigator handling the case. They had found Gilberto in a nearby town, living in a shelter and carrying a bag full of notes similar to the ones he'd left at my house. He claimed he just wanted to help, but his obsession was undeniable. Thankfully, charges were filed, and he was taken into custody. After that, I moved. New house, new city, doing everything I could to protect Sarah and ensure that nightmare would never repeat itself. To this day, I can't hear footsteps upstairs without my heart racing, but I'm grateful that we're safe, and that terrifying Christmas is now just a memory.
I remember it like it was yesterday. It was December, just before Christmas, when everything happened. My wife, Clarice, and I were living in a quiet neighborhood, the kind of place where every house gets decked out with colorful lights and kids go door to door singing Christmas carols. Our life was pretty ordinary, nothing too crazy. I worked from home as a graphic designer during the day, and Clarice ran a small gift shop downtown. But out of nowhere, he just disappeared. We didn't see him outside anymore. What really got to me was that his house lights stayed on all night, something he never did before. And then there was this other thing. He walked with a cane and struggled to get around, but one night I saw a shadow moving quickly through his living room, like someone young and agile. I brought it up to Clarice, but she brushed it off. We enjoyed the peace and quiet of that neighborhood. But that year, something strange started happening with our neighbor, Mr. Thompson. He was an older man, a bit reserved, but always polite. In the weeks leading up to Christmas, though, his behavior took a sharp turn, kicking off one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. Mr. Thompson used to have this routine of sitting on his porch with his Siamese cat, smoking his pipe, and waving at people as they walked by, saying I was probably imagining things. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. And then, one night, I woke up to this muffled sound, like a scream, coming from his house. It wasn't loud, but it was eerie, and it stayed with me the rest of the night. The next morning, over breakfast, I couldn't stop thinking about that sound. So I made up an excuse to take the trash out and casually walked past his house to get a better look. That's when I noticed something even weirder. His car was parked in the driveway, covered in a thin layer of dust and leaves like it hadn't been used in weeks. For a guy who lived alone and relied on his car for everything, that didn't add up. I decided to ring his doorbell, trying to keep it casual, but there was no answer. Clarice thought I was getting too wrapped up in this, but even she admitted by now that something felt off. Things escalated that same evening. Clarice and I were in the living room watching a Christmas movie, trying to unwind, when we heard a strange noise. It sounded muffled, like furniture being dragged or something heavy being moved, coming from Mr. Thompson's house. Clarice froze, and I turned off the TV to listen more closely. Then there was a loud thud, followed by dead silence. We just sat there, staring at each other, unsure of what to do. I was about to go outside and check when Clarice grabbed my arm and said, "Wait, what if it's dangerous? Maybe we should call the police." Despite her hesitation, I knew we couldn't just ignore it. I called the cops, trying not to come across as the nosy neighbor with an overactive imagination. To my surprise, they took it seriously and said they'd send someone to check it out. While we waited, we kept watching from the window. Mr. Thompson's house looked even creepier with those Christmas lights blinking against the dark night. Time felt like it was crawling, but eventually we saw the flashing red and blue lights of the patrol car. 2 officers got out, knocked on his door, and when no one answered, started looking around the property. From our vantage point, we saw them check the garage and then the side windows. That's when one of them pointed to something that looked like an entrance to the basement. The tension was palpable as Clarice gripped my hand, her eyes locked on the scene outside. A few minutes later, another police car arrived, and the officers started moving more cautiously. They broke down the front door and went inside. We watched from the window, feeling like we were trapped in a nightmare. After what felt like an eternity, we saw the officers coming out with someone. It wasn't Mr. Thompson. It was a young woman, looking completely shaken, wearing dirty, tattered clothes. Clarice gasped and covered her mouth, and a chill ran down my spine. What was happening in that house? After the woman was taken to an ambulance, the police stayed in the house for hours. The activity didn't stop, and more patrol cars kept showing up. What was supposed to be a quiet December evening had turned into utter chaos. When we finally saw Mr. Thompson being escorted out in handcuffs, Clarice let out a gasp of pure shock. He looked nothing like the man we thought we knew. His face was blank, and the warm, kind eyes we remembered now had a disturbing, empty look. We had no idea what he had done, but it was clear it was something serious. That night, the police didn't give us many details, but the heavy feeling that something horrible had happened lingered in the air. The next day, the news spread like wildfire across town. We learned that Mr. Thompson had been hiding a missing person in his basement. It was the young woman we saw being rescued. She had been missing for months, and no one could understand how he had managed to keep her there without anyone noticing. I kept thinking about how we had missed all the signs, the lights left on, the strange noises, his sudden disappearance from the neighborhood. It had all been right in front of us, but none of us put the pieces together. Clarice became obsessed with the news, reading every detail she could find about the case. I, on the other hand, felt torn between relief and guilt. Relief that the woman was safe, but guilt for not acting sooner. Over the next few days, more details came to light. The woman he had been keeping in the basement was a college student named Helen, who had been missing for nearly 6 months. She had been abducted from a nearby town, and somehow Mr. Thompson had brought her here without anyone noticing. What chilled us the most was Helen's account of what happened. She said he kept her locked in a tiny, dark space, and despite his age and physical limitations, he was meticulous and extremely careful to avoid getting caught. The way he went about his life as though nothing was wrong was terrifying. The harmless, friendly man we thought we knew had a side to him that none of us could have imagined. After that, our street was never the same. The case gained so much attention that reporters started showing up in the neighborhood, and everyone began questioning how well we really knew the people living around us. Clarice was especially shaken since she was the one who often exchanged friendly words with Mr. Thompson. She used to say how kind he seemed, and even joked with him about the Christmas decorations. I tried to reassure her, telling her there was no way anyone could have known, but deep down I felt the same helplessness. If it weren't for the noises we heard that night, who knows how much longer it would have gone on. A few days later, Mr. Thompson's house was sealed off, and he was taken into custody to await trial. Despite the chaos, Christmas still came, but the atmosphere was far from festive. Clarice and I tried to stick to our traditions, decorating the tree, baking cookies, but every attempt at normalcy was interrupted by the haunting memories of that night. The image of Helen being carried to the ambulance stayed with me, as did the hollow look in Mr. Thompson's eyes when he was handcuffed. Deep down, I knew we had done the right thing, but it was clear that this was something we would carry with us forever. A few weeks later, we received a letter from Helen's family thanking us for acting and calling the police. They said that without us, they might never have found her. That brought some comfort, but it also made me reflect on how fragile normalcy really is. All of this happened right next door. in the house of a neighbor who seemed harmless. From that moment on, I could never look at our neighborhood the same way again. What happened in Mr. Thompson's house was a harsh reminder that evil can be closer than we think, hiding behind friendly gestures and twinkling Christmas lights.
I've never been the kind of person who likes spending Christmas alone. I grew up in a big family with all that classic December chaos. Cousins running around the house, my grandma yelling at everyone in the kitchen, and Christmas lights blinking late into the night. But that year was different. I had just moved into my first apartment, a small but cozy place downtown. It was a tough decision, but I was excited to finally start my grown-up life. The thing is, work was crazy end-of-year madness at the office, and with everyone heading home for the holidays, I ended up spending Christmas on my own. I thought it'd be fine, a weekend all to myself, with the Christmas lights glowing and a stash of holiday classics like Home Alone and The Grinch. I just didn't know how quickly that peaceful plan would turn into a nightmare. It started Saturday night. I was curled up on the couch with a blanket, a glass of wine in hand, and the Christmas tree twinkling in the corner. The apartment was quiet, just the sound of the movie playing in the background, when I heard a noise coming from the kitchen. It was a creak, something like wood bending, or maybe a drawer sliding open. At first, I didn't think much of it. I figured it was just the heater making noises. My building's old, and that kind of thing happens all the time. I got up, went to check the kitchen, but everything was in place. Still, I locked the window just to be safe and went back to the couch. The night went on quietly for a bit, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling, like something was off. Later that night, close to midnight, I heard it again. This time, the sound was clearer and coming from the hallway that connects the living room to the front door. It sounded like scratching, something scraping against the wood in an uneven rhythm that made my heart race. I paused the movie, straining to hear better. You know, that kind of silence that makes you even more anxious? Yeah, it was that. I got up slowly, trying not to make any noise, and walked to the door with my phone in hand. I looked through the peephole, but the hallway outside was empty, lit only by those dim yellow lights that always flickered. I wanted to convince myself it was just my imagination, maybe the neighbor upstairs, but when I got back to the couch, I wasn't as calm as I tried to be. I tried to focus on the movie again, but it was hard to ignore the tension creeping in. That's when I noticed the front door handle move. I swear, I saw it shift slow and hesitant, like someone was testing to see if the door was unlocked. My whole body froze. I couldn't even react at first. I just sat there, frozen, trying to figure out what to do. I took a deep breath and walked back to the door, moving as quietly as I could. This time, I didn't even look through the peephole. I just stood there in complete silence, waiting. The sound stopped suddenly, and as much as I wanted to believe it was all in my head, my adrenaline was already through the roof. I grabbed my phone and opened the emergency app, ready to call the cops if I had to. I don't know how long I stood there, just listening for anything on the other side of the door. The silence was almost worse than the noises. After a few minutes, I decided it was probably just my imagination playing tricks on me. Still, just to be safe, I shoved a chair against the door. Not exactly high-tech security, but it gave me a little peace of mind. I decided to head to my bedroom and try to sleep. I turned off all the lights in the living room, leaving only the Christmas tree glowing, and locked my bedroom door too. I felt kind of ridiculous for being so paranoid, but at the same time, I couldn't shake that cold, creeping feeling in the back of my mind that something was seriously wrong. I lay down on the bed, but sleep wasn't happening. I just stared at the ceiling, straining to hear anything, when another sound came from the kitchen. This time, it wasn't a creak or a scratch, it was clearer, the sound of a cabinet door opening. My heart was racing, and for a second, I thought I had imagined it. But then it happened again, a low noise, like something being dragged across the floor. The kitchen was on the opposite side of the apartment, far from my bedroom, and at that moment, I realized just how isolated I was. I grabbed my phone and, without hesitation, called the police. The operator was calm and patient, asking me to stay on the line, but I could barely get the words out. I explained what was happening, and she assured me that an officer was on the way. Waiting for them felt like an eternity. I sat on the floor, leaning against my bedroom door, gripping my phone so tightly it hurt. My heart was pounding so loud it felt like anyone nearby could hear it. Then I heard something that froze me in place, footsteps. They were light, shuffling, and coming from the direction of the living room. I couldn't pinpoint exactly where, but I knew it wasn't my imagination. They were too slow and deliberate to be normal. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound, but my whole body was tense. The blinking lights from the Christmas tree still lit up the living room, and for some reason, that made everything feel even more surreal. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, I heard a knock at the front door. It wasn't aggressive or someone trying to force their way in, but firm and rhythmic. My heart jumped, and then I heard a voice. "This is the police. Please open the door." I almost collapsed with relief. Still trembling, I unlocked the bedroom door and made my way to the front. Peeking through the peephole, I saw two uniformed officers standing there. I quickly removed the chair blocking the door, unlocked it, and let them in. I started explaining what had happened, words tumbling out of my mouth, but they stayed calm and professional. The officers stepped inside with their flashlights, instructing me to stay behind them as they checked the apartment. They headed straight for the kitchen, where I'd heard the clearest noises. They opened every cabinet, checked behind the fridge, and even inspected the window I had locked earlier. Nothing. No signs of forced entry, nothing out of place. They moved on to the living room, then the bedroom, thoroughly searching every corner. Meanwhile, I stayed near the front door, my hands still shaking. The adrenaline was coursing through me, but there was also a wave of relief that they hadn't found anyone. That relief, however, didn't last long. As they finished up and returned to the front door, one of the officers noticed something I hadn't seen before: scratches. Thin but deep marks on the outside of the door, near the doorknob, as if someone had used a metal tool to try to pick the lock. He called me over to show me, his expression serious. "Are you sure you locked the door?" he asked. I nodded, almost offended. "Of course I did," I said firmly. He gave a thoughtful nod and took a picture of the marks. He explained that it could be used as evidence, but without witnesses or something more concrete, there wasn't much they could do besides filing a report. When the officers finished their inspection, one of them gave me some advice: upgrade the locks, install a security camera, and try to avoid spending too much time alone in the apartment, especially during the holidays when buildings tend to be emptier. They assured me they'd increase patrols in the area that night, but honestly, that didn't make me feel much better. After they left, the silence crept back in, that heavy, suffocating kind of silence that seems to fill every corner. Even though they hadn't found anyone, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't alone. That night, I didn't sleep a wink. Every creak of the building felt amplified. Every shadow cast by the Christmas lights seemed more menacing. By the time the sun started to rise, I had already made up my mind I wasn't spending another night there. I called a friend and asked if I could crash at their place for a few days. When I came back, I installed a camera at the door and replaced the lock with something more secure, but the sense of safety I once had was gone. To this day, I still don't know what happened or who was trying to get in that night. What stuck with me was the paranoia, the lingering feeling that something wasn't right, and the unsettling truth that I might never really know.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.